All right, thanks. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave Waters. I'm the Truies Natural Capital Lead. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Toowoomba region, the Jawa and Guyabal people, and First Nations people who have walked, cared and for and maintained this land. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging as well, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who may have actually dialed in today. So I want to say welcome and thanks for attending today's online session. Today we'll be focusing on Natural Capital Region. Now, just remember though that it's part of a broader Natural Capital suite, which is a collection of integrated apps connecting the supply side and the demand side of nature investment. And we use a consistent science-backed currency throughout, which is really important to us. Now, the investment process, it starts with planning, right? And that's what Natural Capital Region is about. So today, we thought it was important that Rob will get into a bit of detail about how we capture those initial conditions in Natural Capital Region. But 2 points I want to make before I hand over to you, Rob. One, I want to reiterate, and I've said this on previous online sessions as well, that I think it's really important to mention that these final set of indicators that we'll talk about today were derived through an extensive consultation process. So we ran national workshops. I think there was about 12, 80 odd people attended with experts in each area and to come up with this final set of indicators. But the second one is to look at the NRM plans around Australia and annual reports to ensure that we captured the indicators that NRM organisations care about and report on now. And just the second point I want to make is that these data sets are scalable, meaning that we use this data across a number of the products. So that ensures consistency in language, but also the approach that we take. So before I hand to you, Rob, I just want to acknowledge the amazing work you've done trying to pull these disparate data sets together to collate a national seamless data layers for a lot of the metrics. So well done on that one. I know it's been a big challenge for you, so well done. Anyway, I'll hand over to you, Rob, to talk about what's under the hood. And if I could ask that people just hold off questions until the end, that'd be great. Thanks, Rob.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. I'll just try to share my screen. So for those who haven't met me, my name is Rob Ellis, and just trying to share the screen. David, if you can confirm I've got the right screen shared in a moment, that'd be great. My job title is
Yes.
modelling lead for Truie, and we'll be looking at some of the data sets behind our Natural Capital suite of tools. So David and I, in previous roles, did a lot of work in the water quality modelling world, where I learned a lot about analysing and manipulating large data sets. It's been interesting branching out into the broader natural capital sense. So I've really enjoyed this role. So today we are looking primarily at Natural Capital Region, and some of the data sets we'll talk about where we source them from, perhaps some of the manipulation we do around those. And we're talking about Natural Capital Region. This is a tool that really the strength of Natural Capital Region, my apologies, my dog barking comes through. What are the chances that would happen right now? Is Natural Capital Region is meant to be able to allow you to do really, really customized and complex modeling of broad scale planning situations. So as we'll see today, I'm going to show you how we do a lot of the data pre-processing, some of the traditional sort of GIS spatial analysis you might consider to have those initial conditions and whether they're pollutant pools or socioeconomic metrics sitting behind the structure of the system, so that Natural Capital Region can do what it does well, which is modeling your actions and scenarios, whether they're positive or negative, through time and matching those to your budget projections. So Natural Capital Region is intentionally not a GIS. The first thing we'll look at will be the interface, and you'll see there is a spatial sort of an interface for the condition, but it's intentionally not a GIS, and nor is it meant to replace the work that your corporate data management people do. Sometimes people can get a bit sensitive around those things and feel like we're trying to step on toes, but we're definitely not. So if we look at Natural Capital Region as users would see when they come into our web-based tool here, all of our tools are web-based, so you don't need any specific or any special software, no proprietary software required. This all runs in your browser. Natural Capital Region, you'll look at it, it will show you the condition, the initial state of your area of interest. So I've used Southeast Queensland here. We have several of these for different parts of Australia already. One of the first things that you would notice if you were looking across the top of the map there's a few radio buttons that allow you to change the scope or the scale of the spatial unit which is being represented in your view. So it's starting at our lowest level of hierarchy, so the finest detail, which we've called subcatchments. But you can click and you can view those same conditions at the catchment scale. I won't bother depicting what the region scale looks like, because it would be one spatial feature. But that nested hierarchy, that structure is an important thing to start considering. And we'll have a look at how we might go about building those shortly, but keep that nesting in mind, that we'd like to be able to populate all of the data in the initial condition and all the state variables at that lowest level of hierarchy and aggregate them up for you as we go along. And if we jump back to the subcatchment scale and we change from the report screen to the condition hotspot screen, you can see we've got this kind of limited red to blue symbology, where red is in general worst and best is in general the best condition. It's, again, we're not dealing with a high functioning GIS here. The symbology is it's allowing you to compare the relativity between some of these spatial features, but you shouldn't view the colors as being indicative of any particular magnitude. There will be some places where you will have a reported load or area or proportional area given to you, but in most of these condition pages, it's just allowing you the relative distinction between the spatial units of interest to you. And the good thing is that the things that we're looking at here, these are the metrics that when you start to design your actions and build those actions into scenarios, you'll be working against these exact indicators and the metrics sitting behind them. So you can see here in our initial screen, we were looking at a mixture of all of the indicators, and here I've selected to show me just one of the water quality indicators, which is the worst in the red through to the blue in the best in terms of the generation of sediment, fine sediment from hill slope processes. But we can change that and we can look at the generation of bacteria being delivered to our waterways, those sorts of things, and also the extent or lack of riverine woody vegetation. So again, we've got to be careful that we don't present all of the raw numbers in this particular state, so it can be difficult to sometimes interpret. And in fact, that one there would be the reason that we're getting a red color is that the analysis we've done that we'll look at shortly would indicate that there's the potential to have a bit more riverine woody vegetation in those red units than is currently present based on our spatial analysis. So, like I said, the hotspot visuals allow you to interact with the indicators, but intentionally the symbology is left visually pleasing, but you don't get to control those and play around like you do in a GIS, because we're not trying to replicate a fully functioning GIS opinion. What's our last one there? We've got a social economic condition one there as well. Okay, so we'll jump out of the interface and we'll start to look at how the TRUI team develop these instances of natural capital region and how we then insert or analyze the supporting data to give you your indicators and metrics. So I mentioned at the beginning of my spiel that we like to have a nested structure of fine resolution up to a large aggregation for your whole region. And this is important when you're thinking not just of the visuals in that condition page, but when you start to consider the way you might build actions and analyze the reports coming out of your scenarios. So this 3-level of hierarchy allows you to supply reports and share reports with your colleagues and perhaps your funding bodies, where you can really burrow down to detail and you can apply actions in different parts of your region, and you can do reporting that also is related to just some small sections of an area or bundle them up as a whole. So it's a really dynamic sort of system. So we have this 3-tiered hierarchy. We, based on our experience in our previous roles, we tend to like to use surface hydrology, subcatchments, catchments, and basins. We're familiar with them and we know we can in general nest those up. So in preparation for rolling these systems out and giving people a chance to become familiar, we are gradually working with, it's not the Bureau of Meteorology data set here, we're using a similar suite of subcatchments and catchments from another source. And we are gradually going through and naming these and relating them in terms of the ability to be aggregated from a subcatchment to a catchment there, as I've just linked through to a sub-basin and then through to a basin. So we recognize that everyone will have their own, most NRM regions will have their own regions or set of spatial structures they would like to report to. But in the interest of getting the dialogue happening, we think that we can at least help people and begin the process. So we've been going through and doing this. Now that data set we're looking at there, which comes from the Hydro Rivers suite of tools, it'll be important because we'll see some of that data popping back up as we move through and look at some of the specific data sets that we use. So that's how we would, if we were to create you a natural capital region instance for your area of interest, we would probably default to one of the spatial structures we've seen there and try to cut out for you a hierarchy that works. If we then moved on to the actual indicators and the data that sits behind the indicators, if you can think back to when we had our condition page in front of us, there was a whole bunch of indicators, and as David referred to, through a series of workshops, both the issues that were important to people and the data sources that might support those were identified through a series of collaborative workshops. So some of our socioeconomic indicators we get from places like ABARES and ABS. So these are all publicly accessible data sets, but they can be tricky to attain. They can be tricky to manipulate, whether it's filtering, doing some sort of post-processing, and then also joining them to some sort of spatial feature for representation. Although, pardon me, to their credit, these federal agencies are actually making a lot of their census-related data sets spatially available through a bunch of services as well. So hopefully over time, we'll alleviate a few of the steps that we do of joining these things. But currently we spend a lot of time trawling through the websites of ABARES and ABS, filtering, transforming, I guess in many senses, it's sometimes pivot tabling and those sorts of ideas, and somehow bringing those back in and joining them to a spatial representation. So in this particular picture, we see our indicator of community engagement, which is using the index of education and occupation as put out from the latest census data. And another data set covering all of the country here. You can see there's a bit more definition down around the Victoria, New South Wales area here, because this data set is in fact aligned to a more finely resolved spatial feature layer. And this is regional economic, one of the indices again put out by the ABS. So that's the access to economic resources. So if we were to go and use the structure that we spoke about for an NRM region that we were working on, we would be analysing this data and probably getting it would either be taking an average of these values, or it could be a sum, or it could be an area, depending on the indicator we're looking at. Another source of useful information that covers the whole of Australia is the federal, I'm not going to try to say the whole department, it's DAFF, DAFF is the federal department who are the custodians of the Indigenous estate data set for Australia, and we've got that Indigenous estate here, and we've applied a weighting to some of the categories within that Indigenous estate to indicate the level of participation and, I guess, ability to manage those pieces of land. And again, those metrics would wind up as the indicators inside of your natural capital region project. And some more ABARES things that are coming out here. So I mentioned that one there, the industry agriculture. I think that's probably still a census-related thing. But you can see that each of these data layers will vary quite significantly spatially. Like, it's really interesting there to see that the agricultural economic return is quite limited on the east coast of New South Wales. It would make sense there's relatively less agriculture in that space than there is, say, over in Western Australia there through the wheat belt. So we love being able to visualize some of this information, and we value being able to make these indices and these bits of information relevant to your natural capital region planning processes. Outside of the social and economic, we start to move into production indicators and then into biodiversity. And here's a production indicator that, again, we are sourcing the data for this from census-related ABS data and relating it back to the relevant spatial units here. And in terms of the relative production of methane from, I think this is primarily cattle. I would have to confirm that. It could be all ruminants. We've looked at the 10-year average herd size through the statistical zones that the ABS is dealing with, and we've compared that to the maximum herd size over that same period. And you can start to see whether you're sitting towards the top of that maximum herd size, or whether you might have been reducing your herd size, with the implication being fewer beasts, less methane. So that would be sitting in behind the methane indicator as we were building those. As we move from production into biodiversity, for a consistent estimation of where we have woody vegetation throughout Australia, we default to using this Australia-wide, the Australian Forest Extent from 2023 dataset, which comes to us courtesy of the federal DCEEWW, I think people call it. We like this data set. It's pretty big. It covers all Australia, and I think it's at about a 30-metre pixel resolution. But it's easy enough to handle in desktop environments because it is representing one simple feature, the presence or absence of forest. We have toyed with the idea of using either Digital Earth Australia data from Geoscience Australia, which could further categorise the existence of forest into different grades, but we don't need to do that for our purposes for natural capital region, but we certainly have those related data sets sitting around. And in relation to that woody vegetation, which we think is a really important part of our biodiversity consideration, we also try to collect information around both protected areas. So this is the Commonwealth Collaborative Australian Protected Areas Database, which tells us where there are things like national parks and other sorts of protected areas, which is really important in terms of if there's vegetation inside of those. We would assume that inside of a natural capital region scenario, you wouldn't be actively trying to remove that vegetation. Outside of those zones, you might be. Now, this is a nice starting point for considering those. However, if we move further into different jurisdictions, we know there are bits of legislation around that, and we'll have a look at some of these in a second, but the legislation around the ability to interact with that vegetation might change. So we start with that national viewpoint, and then depending on the jurisdiction we're working in, we'll overlay some more layers of information. Such as we move down, I've gone to Tasmania here just to give us a nice convenient place to look at, but we could choose any of the other jurisdictions across Australia. We start by aggregating the land use distribution and providing that in a sense that will inform natural capital regions. So these are very broad land use categories. We take them from the accepted Australian Collaborative Land Use Mapping Program, and we synthesize them back to this a list of about 15 or 16 land uses or land types that we think will be of relevance to people. And again, we can take the Commonwealth data. They've done a bit of work aggregating those, or if we have in the case here, we can pull in the state or the state contributed land use layers and use those instead. So that's what we tend to do. We use the land use primarily from within the jurisdiction we're working in. In addition to the land use distribution, we might also try to represent where the significant wetland extents exist. So here we've classified the entirety of the Tasmanian landmass into whether it's simply terrestrial or whether it's identified by the Tasmanian authorities as a relevant wetland body. We have this for each of the jurisdictions. So we've got estuarine, lake estuarine, so your large lakes, your swamps and your paleoestuarine. And your riverine data sets, we actually haven't pulled in from the local jurisdiction here. This is harking back to that hydro basins and hydro rivers data set I referred to previously. It gives us a nice consistent approach to estimating the length of streams and therefore the area occupied by riparian areas across Australia. It gives us some relativity amongst our natural capital region instances. Finally, I get back to the more about clearing of land and protected areas. I mentioned that we start with the Commonwealth or the national scale indication of where there are protected areas. But then within jurisdictions, we dig in, we try to understand the legislative requirements or the legal requirements landowners and land custodians might have to adhere to if they do want to interfere with existing vegetation. So in Tasmania, there are these planning zones, this data set we can pull out and we can interpret from those how we might create a mask of potentially clearable existing woody vegetation versus woody vegetation that is not potentially clearable. And in other jurisdictions, we see other sorts of data sets. So in Queensland, there's a thing called Category X vegetation that we would utilise. In Victoria, we have this native vegetation regulation location data set, and in Western Australia, there's some clear regulation data layers as well. So we like to bring those in to make sure that when we layer up and combine those layers of land use, wetlands, forest, and the clearable characteristics of those forests, that we use the locally representative information. So we end up with these sorts of, in terms of just the distribution of clearable versus non-clearable woody vegetation, this is the sort of mask we get for Tasmania. And again, we'll have that matched throughout each of our jurisdictions. And that will also be layered over with the wetland classifications, as to whether it's purely terrestrial, whether there are some wetland considerations there as well. And they all form part of the biodiversity suite of indices inside of natural capital region. I also have here, Tasmania is a bad place to demonstrate this one because it's such a really good place to live. But we do have this metric about the resilience of the landscape in agricultural environments to persist and retain some sort of ground cover, and resist erosion during really, really dry periods, so drought conditions. So we love that the Queensland government had developed a dynamic reference cover method and a comparative method for seeing how one particular area of land was comparing to its neighbours across locally and across a broader sort of bioregion scale. That data layer is not available for all the jurisdictions of Australia. However, it is in our systems. We've gone and replicated that dynamic reference cover method across the different jurisdictions, which is no mean feat because it does take a large amount of data pre-processing, and then the process itself takes a long time to run if you actually apply the real dynamic reference cover method using the G-Fortran code and the Python code that talks together. It runs for a long time, but we have that, and we've used that to help provide your metric of landscape resilience. So we really like that. We think we're probably the first people outside of government to start providing that sort of metric consistently throughout Australia, which we're pretty proud of. If we move outside of the biodiversity indicators, move into the things that I'm a little more comfortable with and a little more familiar with, it's our water quality indicators and how they would give loads or areas or rates for natural capital region. And I'll start with one that is probably our most simplistic representation. Before I dig too far into the gully method here per se, it is important to reiterate something David mentioned earlier on, is that for our natural capital region setup, we will have done a bunch of the spatial analysis and processing, and we will be populating a natural capital region instance with a load or an area of a pollutant or a forest and those sorts of things. However, the methods and the data layers will scale, particularly for water quality, will scale down. And when we get to our hill slope and our stream bank methods, we'll see that we've done a continental scale approach, but definitely the methods and the data layers will lend themselves to application inside of our natural capital project suite and other related analyses at that level. So for trying to estimate the background or existing load of fine sediment and related pollutants from gully erosion throughout Australia, we have adopted a very old data set, but it covers the country, that covers in the National Land and Water Resources Audit, and it gives us a density of gullies in kilometres per kilometre squared. In fact, this is the data layer that supported the initial establishment of the Paddock to Reef Water Quality Modelling Program. We know that it isn't perfect in places. We also know it's better than having no information on the location and the distribution of gullies. So we've adopted that, and we've written some tools for our team to work through. And based on local data and trawling through the existing studies or existing reports, we will convert that density of gullies into a load of fine sediment per unit area based on some metrics that we think are representative of the climate and the landscapes that they occur in. And we can apply those differently throughout parts of Australia if we choose to. If we move into the stream bank erosion part, this is one of the things that we're really proud of. We've, again, using that Hydro Rivers data set that I spoke about earlier on, this map looks like it's got no gaps in between it, but in fact, it's just the way that I've drawn the rivers. We're looking at about 360,000 individual stream segments from the Hydro Rivers data set, which isn't always perfect. We know that any automated delineation of stream networks will make some mistakes in places, but we've taken that data set and we have developed a method. As I said, it will scale down to site and reach length if you so choose to apply the SEDNet stream bank erosion algorithm. We've done it here for the whole of the country. So we've had to repeat an analysis for each of those 360,000 locations that looks at the local catchment size, the upstream catchment area as well, identifies the long-term mean annual average rainfall for the local and the further afield. So you can imagine these 360,000 units nesting up and having to be repeated many, many times. That gives us some metrics to do with the SEDNet stream bank erosion algorithm. From that, we can start to predict using the physical characteristics of what the streams might be, which again, we have another predictor for. We can start to come up without having to model the complete flow regime on a daily flow time step. We can start to replicate the requirements of the SEDNet stream bank erosion model, where we can estimate what the bank full flow rate might be and those sorts of things. And another big part of the data analysis for that was to come up with a representative slope for each of those 360,000 stream lengths. So we have defaulted to using a slope from a Geoscience Australia elevation model that is made publicly available. We just had to write the script that went out and perform the analysis against those rather than downloading all that data. So we're really proud of that. And please be aware, like I've manipulated the color, the symbology there to make things look really, really different. When you actually just the data is heavily skewed. There's a small number of rivers that would have a potentially high stream bank erosion rate. most rivers across Australia are pretty benign. They've got low slopes, they've got low flows, they've got good vegetation in a lot of places. So normally, if you did this under a natural sort of a symbology, you would just see everything as kind of blue. But I wanted to impress you, so I played with symbology there. If you want to know more details on the methodology and start to think about how it would scale down to natural capital project, individual reach scale, please feel free to reach out to us. David will be presenting that work for us on behalf of us all at the ModSim conference coming up in a few weeks' time. Moving on from Streambank, we can again look at another one of the typical water quality processes that people like to consider for natural capital instances. And we look at the hill slope erodibility. So what I've got here is just one of the layers that feeds into what is called the revised universal soil loss equation. Again, work that has been applied across Australia for decades. Most notably in the recent times has been the paddock to reef work throughout the Great Barrier Reef catchments. We have extended that concept, but we've actually gone and built first and foremost what is considered the soil erodibility factor for that universal soil loss equation. And I think outside of government and probably inside of government too, we're probably the first people to have a crack at providing that erodibility factor across the country at a 90-metre pixel. Again, it takes a fair bit of effort to get there, but we're really proud of that. We've also utilised in there Geoscience Australia dataset, which is the weathering intensity index, which helps us to moderate some of the predictions that come out if you're just looking at soil characteristics alone. So that's our soil erodibility part of the revised universal soil loss equation. And then we also pull in the rainfall and calculated rainfall factor from SILO, the long-term annual average rainfall that we can process spatially. And we can infer the slope again from Geoscience Australia, put out the shuttle radar D, and we can use the slope and get the sequence factors there. So when we bundle this up, and we'll have a look in a second as to how it might look for Tasmania into what would the erosion rate in tonnes per hectare of sediment be when you multiply all those factors together. For natural capital region, we will use a 10-year average of the relevant ground cover in the season that we think is most important to picking up the worst ground cover. So in the northern parts of the country, we use the spring season where we're coming out of the dry period, and we'll flip that on its head in the wetter southern parts of the state of the country. So we'll average the ground cover in those periods, and what we'll see in natural capital region is the long-term average ground cover applied to the metrics of soil and slope and those sorts of things. Another point of difference that we do different to paddock to reef and probably other systems as well, is we do take into consideration the impact of canopy cover from trees and large shrubs, and also we make that an even more powerful impact in areas that are managed as dedicated conservation areas that have trees. So we have those things built in to moderate the estimates of hill slope erosion. We will look at some of that stuff shortly. As I say, the idea is once we run those sorts of processes at the relevant jurisdiction scale, we will then aggregate them to put them into those spatial features we looked at the beginning of my talk. So here we're looking at Tasmania, and I've got just simply displayed to you is one potential suite of sub-catchments that you might use to aggregate into catchments and then a whole region if you're doing that. And for all these socio-economic or biodiversity or water quality indicators, we will do some sort of process that either averages or sums or converts things to an area or a proportion of an available area. And they are what sit behind the initial state and the condition in natural capital region. So here for Tasmania, this is the result of that universal soil loss equation. So we're not looking at gullies here. We're not looking at stream banks. We're looking just at the potential for deriving fine sediment from the hill slope erosion processes. And it's a bit of a mess. It's a bit hard to interpret at that stage. But what we do is we run a process over that will find a representative value for each of our planning units or subcatchments. So again, don't be alarmed at the red through the blue. I was doing this quite rapidly in GIS. The difference between hill slope erosion rates across Tasmania is actually really small. It's one of those cases where, because we're looking at just an isolated area, I've tried to stretch and exaggerate to show there are differences. And of course, we're dealing with loads here. So you can see those large red-looking scary beasts on the west coast of Australia. They happen to be pretty large spatial units too. So even though their rate in tonnes per hectare might be smaller than some other areas, they come up looking quite alarming as a load. But that's important because when you go to apply your actions and scenarios in your systems, your actions will be applied to against, in water quality sense, the existing load anyway. So That's why we don't try to manipulate that to make it as a tonne per hectare to make it more visually pleasing. Those are the loads that you will be interacting with in your actions and scenarios. Same sort of process. We do the gully erosion process, and we can see where there are likely to be more concerns around the generation of fine sediment and associated pollutants from gully erosion, and the same thing for our stream bank erosion. So the ability to take those national scale data sets, but then put the finer scale ground cover or slope from Geoscience Australia in most cases 30 megapixel resolution, and perform those calculations. They're large, they're unseemly. We don't want you guys to have to do them. We want Natural Capital Region to focus on the application of actions and scenarios. So we've done that heavy processing here and fed them through. And another interesting mechanism we've worked through is using the National Pollutant Inventory data. We do pick up on the locations and the annual loads of nutrients, dissolved nutrients mostly coming out of sewage treatment plants. And we also pick up on the bacterial and chemical, likely bacterial and chemical outputs coming from piggeries and feedlots that are reported through the National Pollutant Inventory. So we've got them scattered about there. Same sort of process. We analyze those, we add them up in this case. It's not an average, it's adding up within those regions. And that's how in Natural Capital Region, you get the one simple interface that shows you the distribution of the consideration of whether it's dissolved nutrients or microbes in some cases, but that's how the data has found its way in to your work. I think I'm getting close to the end. I have. So the whole point of me talking to you guys today was to give you some confidence over the effort that has been put into both identifying relevant data for the indicators of importance in Natural Capital Region, but also we've tried to apply techniques and methods that respect that data and what the data is meant for, but also made it relevant to your planning needs in Natural Capital Region. So we've done a bunch of transforming intersections to inform the condition. And we do that intentionally to make sure that Natural Capital Region doesn't have to do more of that. So Natural Capital Region can do what it's designed to do and do really, really complex action and scenario modeling. And it can lead to spatial analysis, but related tools at a site level, all for you to do yourselves. But we think that by providing the data in this format, we can open up all sorts of potential to people. So David, I think that's it for me. And we might open up to questions. We'll probably stop sharing my screen for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. Yep. So we'll hand over to questions. A couple of things I just want to comment, Rob, is like people, you can clearly see that Rob and the wrangling team have really leading the way in terms of spatial modelling in Australia, I believe, and having a crack at a whole lot of new approaches. But importantly, all of our methods are published. We ensure that we try and publish all the methods for any of our approaches, the hill slope method, and as Rob said, with the stream bank method, we'll present them so they're publicly available. And the other thing, I suppose, Rob, is that now you've streamlined the process with scripts and repeatable methods that you can knock up a version of Natural Capital Region pretty much for anywhere in Australia now in a pretty short time if anyone was chosen up. Would that be fair?
Yeah, it is fair, David. It depends on the degree of customization that people might require, whether it was a different sort of metric, which we can do if needed. But you're right, if for a standard Natural Capital Region, it doesn't take us long to turn these things around. I probably should have mentioned, David, too, and you just alluded to there, in that hill slope erosion space, I described it with how we've done Natural Capital Region and use a 10-year average. I should have gone on to say also that we do have the ability, through a published paper, the ability to infer what the ground cover changes might be and also the tree response changes might be in response to land management decisions, and infer a hill slope erosion outcome from those. So it's not all just about 10-year averages. We do have the ability to analyse the individual data sets and provide that temporally informative information as well.
That's great. So anyone got a question for Rob or the team?
While we're waiting for questions, can I jump in with a comment?
Yeah. Totally
great, Rob. I've forgotten how much when you see all those layers all together in one show. There's been a lot of long conversations there. So as Rob went through, there's two aspects really to that collective data as well. So there's the representation of the condition, but there's also the representation of the available area where you can do work. And this is kind of a feature of Natural Capital Region, where we want to know the initial condition And then we want to investigate a potential investment portfolio where we'll do some action. For example, we're going to revegetate the riparian zones. Well, we need to know how much of the riparian zone is unvegetated as well. So we have this initial condition state, but we also have that condition state associated with different pools. So not just total sediment load, but where that sediment's coming from.
Yeah.
And then those different areas of available land that we might do work on, so that we effectively do the accounting to manage the water quality improvement reductions, dealing with the right pools. So there's a fair bit of accounting that goes on behind the scenes once you press run for a scenario in region as well.
Yeah, and obviously where possible, we'll refer to local peer-reviewed literature to say, well, you know, are we sort of in the ballpark of our estimates? Rob's certainly done that across Australia as well to sort of constrain those numbers as well.